What do you do about that? Do you attribute to the illness? Do you blame it to the illness? Do you let her off the hook? And the answer is, you pay as much attention as you possibly can. So she moves ahead as much as she can, but no more. And that judgment is it's so difficult to make, especially with someone who's ill.
And maybe that's part of our scattered attention and focus right now, right? I mean, if everything moved from, texts to blogs to posts to tweets to Instagram, right? Like our attention is so focused that maybe that's part of the process of collapsing the space you said between sin and syndrome, because it's not that complicated in some ways, to have that sort of conversation with somebody. Like
right,
the conversation
but it has to be personal, right?
Well, and you have to really slow down and take time in the morning to say, okay, what's going on? Can you really not get out of bed?
Syndrome. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Like, okay, you can't get out of bed. Great. We'll try tomorrow. Or, it's a very delicate proposition because you're dealing with people's vulnerabilities. And if you get it wrong.
Well, and you also have to help them test it. So I remember one time we were going to buy her a scooter so she could get around. And so she had to go and take motorcycle lessons. And somebody crashed the motorcycle a bit at one of the lessons. And she woke up in the morning and she was afraid to go. And no wonder, she just had a hip replacement. So she was on like a motorbike 3 weeks later. And so it was risky, but we thought, man, this kid's got to be able to move around. And she was afraid to go. And so her mother said to her, why don't you just get out of bed and come with me in the car? And then when you get there, you can see if you can do this or not, and maybe you can't. And then, well, when she got there, and so that was that judicious pushing. Is it sin or syndrome? Well, it's no wonder you're afraid. And so we think we're crazy in some sense. Like, you just had your hip replaced, now we're putting you on a motorbike. That's a big risk. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe you're right to be afraid. And so then you test it, right? That's collaborative empiricism. That's what the behaviorists call it. It's like, well, maybe this is the right way forward. Why don't we go out and test it a little bit?
Well, and it takes an incredible amount of empathy without falling into complete empathy. Right? Because you have to be aware if someone says, no, I have different limitations than you, Dad, right?
Yeah.
I actually can't do that, and maybe you could now or when you were my age. But it's being incredibly attuned to the differences without falling into the ease of 100% empathy solves all problems.
But also, I think we need to be careful not to confuse these things. We don't have to deny that there are victims and injustices or anything else to say that it's always good to be open to what you don't understand or what is beyond you, or to be open to the burning bush in your own life. So
especially then.
They don't have to be in any way confused. I mean, that it's an absolute, no matter what you're going through. That rigidity, there's more than you see.
And rigidity is the enemy, always.
But that's especially the case with God, that we're so tempted to think in anthropomorphic terms about God as a moral agent, that is to say, as a member of our moral community, and to evaluate him as if we would evaluate the Pharaoh. I think that's why, Stephen quoting the last verse of Job, that's a brilliant observation, I think, that God is the source of all goodness. In the classical theistic tradition, he's identical with goodness. He's that in virtue of which any good action is a good action.
Well, it also means that if the victim is only construing himself or herself as a victim and everyone else is doing that, you're also in some sense saying to them that there is no pathway forward through this, right? Yeah. There is no possibility of the miraculous revelation. And that the miraculous revelation might not even be a cure. It might be that if you could see what's beckoning properly, at least while you're dying, you'd have this love and support around you that you need, so that isn't utter hell, right?
Well, it's also the shame motif we're talking about. Moses hid his face. It's Adam and Eve. Because if you can get to the place that you're not a hapless victim in the face of the injustices of the universe objectively, and there is a part that has to do with you, that's going to produce shame. And you have to be strong enough to get through shame to see and confront the burning bush and be transformational. I was struck so much in reading Exodus, how much of that is a recurring motif.
I just want to add when I explain to people the fundamental difference between a religious education, Jewish or Christian, and a secular education in our time, I say it this way. I was raised, the biggest problem in Dennis Prager's life is Dennis Prager.
Right.
In secular schools, in our time, the greatest problem in your life is America, racism, sexism, homophobia, your parents, never you, always something outside of you. And that dichotomy,
It destroys your agency.
Totally.
it totally.
Completely. Well, and that's the point in some real sense.
It's an incredible thing because it destroys you and the society.
Right.
It's disempowering, to coin a word.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, right.
To coin right.
All right, so, and the magicians did so with their enchantments to bring forth lice, but they could not. So there lice upon man and upon beast. Then the magician said unto Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. And the Lord said unto Moses, rise up early in the morning, and stand before Pharaoh. Lo, he cometh forth to the water. So we're in the next cycle, right? The beginning of the next cycle. And say unto him, thus saith the Lord, let my people go, that they may serve me. Else, if thou wilt not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies upon thee and upon thy servants and upon thy people and into thy houses. It's another humiliation, real humiliation there of the Pharaoh. And the houses of Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground whereon they are. And I will sever in that day the land of Goshen in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, to the end thou may knowest that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. And I will put a division between my people and thy people. Tomorrow shall this sign be. And the Lord did so. And there came a grievous swarm of flies into the house of Pharaoh and into his servants' houses and into all of the land of Egypt. The land was corrupted by reason of the swarm of flies. And Pharaoh called for Moses and for Aaron and said, go ye, sacrifice to your God in the land. And Moses said, it is not meet, it is not right, so to do, for we shall sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians to the Lord our God. Lo, shall we sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians before their eyes, and will they not stone us? We will go 3 journeys into the wilderness, and sacrifice to the Lord our God, as he shall command us. And Pharaoh said, I will let you go, that ye may sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness, only you shall not go very far away. Entreat for me. Now, the abomination of the Egyptians, if I remember correctly, the Egyptians held cows as sacred. It's something like that. The Hebrews were going to sacrifice something that the Egyptians would regard as appalling to sacrifice, right? As sacred. Exactly. And so Moses basically objects when the Pharaoh says, well, you can do it here in Egypt. Moses says, no, we can't do it because the Egyptians will be very upset with us. We have to go away from them to do this. So that's what that abomination of the Egyptians means.
The Paschal sacrifice is a god of Egypt.
Right. Okay. So that's really the crucial issue there. Right. Okay. So they're sacrificing the god of the Egyptians. It's no wonder the Egyptians are upset about that. So, and Pharaoh said, I will let you go, that you may sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness. Only you shall not go very far away, for obvious reasons. Entreat for me. And Moses said, behold, I go out from thee, and I will entreat the Lord that the swarms of flies may depart from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people tomorrow. But let not Pharaoh deal deceitfully any more in not letting the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. And Moses went out from Pharaoh and entreated the Lord. And the Lord did, according to the word of Moses. And he removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people. There remained not one. And Pharaoh hardened his heart at this time also. Neither would he let the people go. Great, we're cruising today. Exodus 9. Anything to say about the flies specifically? It's part of this transition?
Yeah, so I think you'll see, so it's moving up, right? So you have got the frogs, this ambiguous, and you got the lice, and you got the flies, and then the next plague, you're going to see a transition, which actually is kind of it's actually an anti-burning bush, by the way, where, well, we'll read it, and then we can talk about it later.
Okay. Okay, so we're moving up the heavenly hierarchy in some sense.
That's right, but like a weird upside down, like a breaking apart of creation through this.
It's also interesting, though, the way this just, in a way, it's just a fly, right? There's a lot of them.
But it's quantity too.
But there's something about
the quantity has to do with the earth. That's what the earth is, right? So you have quality above and you have quantity below. And so when quantity invades, right? When think about it like you could think about it like you have a nation, and then you have the swarms of barbarians that come in, and the quantity just overruns the quality. Right? There's always more outside than there is inside.
So is that the multiplicity overriding the unity?
That's what it is. And that's why it's multiple. It's like you're drowning in frogs, you're drowning in lice, you've got swarms of flies. It's quantity that is overtaking the identity of the Egyptian.
And it's a small thing, right? I mean, it's a lot of these little things, our sins are like that. But a lot of the little ones that adds up. But I just want to quickly draw attention to verse 28, where I'll let you go, that you may sacrifice the Lord your God in the wilderness, only you shall not go very far in Crete for me. And there's this whole sense that you were talking a lot, Jonathan, about the instrumentalization of the Hebrews. And there's this sense like, well, okay, I'll let you sort of pay attention to the transcendent, but only on my terms. So that it's this sense of he's refusing to relinquish. Even the relinquishing is on terms that are not relinquishing. And I think there's a profound sense in which he's absolutely not bowing to the principle, even when he says he is. He's like, well, not really.
Yeah.
When we talk about this kind of divine balance, it's interesting. Jordan and I talk a lot about the big five personality traits as they equate to political orientation, right? High trait openness, right, tends to be more liberal, right? And it's very interesting because when either one is unchecked, right, if it's conservatism unchecked tends to go to tyranny that's specific and encompassed in one person. Liberalism unchecked turns into a swarm that it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. And it's a very interesting.
Well, it is definitely the danger of openness.
That's right.
Because openness
let more in, right? And the difficulty
of multiplicity and contamination.
And and in-group favoritism, right? But the difficulty of let's call it tyrannical closedness, right? Taken to the wrong extreme is new ideas and people don't get in, and you stagnate and ossify.
That's also the kingdom of stone.
Yes.
Because everything's set in stone. And so it's okay. Exodus 9. Then the Lord said unto Moses, go in unto Pharaoh and tell him, thus saith the Lord God of the Hebrews, let my people go, that they may serve me. For if thou refuse to let them go, and wilt hold them still, behold, the hand of the Lord is upon thy cattle, which is in thy field, upon the horses, upon the asses, upon the camels, upon the oxen, and upon the sheep. There shall be a very grievous murrain. And the Lord shall sever between the cattle of Israel and the cattle of Egypt. And that motif is established in this second cycle of plagues. So now it's just the Egyptians that are suffering from this. And so the Lord is marking off his people as immune from the coming plagues. And there shall nothing die of all that is the children of Israel. And the Lord appointed a set time, saying, tomorrow the Lord shall do this thing in the land. And the Lord did that thing on the morrow. And all the cattle of Egypt died. But of the cattle of the children of Israel died not one. And Pharaoh sent, and behold, there was not one of the cattle of the Israelites dead. And the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the people go. And the Lord said unto Moses and unto Aaron, take to you handfuls of ashes of the furnace, and let Moses sprinkle it toward the heaven in the sight of Pharaoh. Now you had some.
This is the transition. Now you really see this transition up into heaven, and it happens in a very strange way, which is almost like an anti-burning bush, which is he's taking soot. Soot is the remainder. It's the residue, right? It's the lowest thing. It's the remainder of a burning process, and so he takes it and he brings it up into the heaven. And then from this moment, you'll see something. All the following plagues will have to do with wind. You'll see the wind that blows the locust, and then the darkness in the sky, the hail and the fire that comes from above. And so it's very interesting because it's almost like taking the remainder, taking the residue and lifting it up as a kind of principle. It's a very strange
the amphibious.
behavior.
It's the role that the frogs played, out of water unto land,
right.
out of land into heaven.
So
And it shall become small dust in all the land of Egypt. So it's blowing around. And shall be a boil breaking forth with blains upon man and upon beast throughout all the land of Egypt. Yeah, these are getting pretty serious, these plagues. And they took ashes of the furnace and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses sprinkled it up toward heaven, and it became a boil, breaking forth with blains upon man. It's like the bubonic plague, and upon beast.
By the way, a lot of people raise the question, why are all the Egyptians suffering? And so that raises the huge issue of, is there such a thing as collective guilt?
Well, there doesn't have to be, Dennis. I don't believe that. One of the things I really learned from Solzhenitsyn in particular, and Rod Dreher has just written about this as well, it's like, you can think of the totalitarian state as the people laboring under the burden of Pharaoh. That's sort of the top-down crimes of obedience theory, right? It's authoritarian leaders, the people are basically innocent, and they work for the tyrant under compulsion. Or you can think, and I was just in Albania talking to people about this, and I went to the museum of the House of Leaves, which was the central museum for their KGB equivalent, and they spied on everyone. And all the Albanians I talked to, left and right, they all said the same thing. Under the Soviets, everyone lied about everything to everyone all the time. And so the tyranny is distributed through the entire system.
That was my point, actually.
Yeah. So
I say the Torah does believe in collective guilt, and by the way, there's a verse which I didn't comment on earlier, where it says, and Pharaoh spoke to all his people. All the people participated in the killing of the Jewish children, of the Hebrew children. So I totally agree with what you said. Clearly, there are individuals who resist,
right.
but that is rare.
They're spared sometimes. I mean, you get that story with Sodom and Gomorrah. You don't need that many good individuals for it to be spared. But I don't think the thing is, I think it's important. It's not collective guilt. It's that everybody in a community has the guilt, but it's because they did something wrong. They're lying.
That's right. Yes.
And if they, so Solzhenitsyn said famously, one man who stops lying can bring down a tyranny. And we've seen examples of that. I would say Gandhi did that to some degree. Martin Luther King did that to some degree. Solzhenitsyn certainly did that to a great and remarkable degree. And so these things clearly happen. And one word of truth will outweigh the whole world. It's like, well, how can it not? Because the truth is immutable and final.
You have to censor truth.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also the case that an unjust ruler can cause enormous destruction to innocent people. So, I don't think we have to conclude that they're all guilty.
But he can't do it alone.
Right.
An unjust ruler alone.
His point is right.
There can still be innocent victims within the collective, which is why it shouldn't be collective
I don't
guilt.
believe there would have been a Holocaust without Hitler. I believe many Germans are guilty, not all, but many. But I do believe that Hitler made the Holocaust possible.
I think they would have called forth another Hitler.
With regard to a Holocaust or with regard to World War II? They're not the same things.
It wouldn't have been the same Holocaust, right? So one of the things I really learned from Jung, because he studied Hitler in great detail and what he accomplished, let's say. So Hitler was a very powerful orator, but he was also a very powerful listener. And Hitler was resentful for a variety of reasons, and he was also obsessed with order and disgust. He's a very strange person. So he had his particular idiosyncrasies that made the Holocaust what it was. But then when he spoke to people, he was like a comedian in the negative sense. So I think I told you guys this story the other day. Jimmy Carr, the comedian, before he goes out on his world tours, he goes and does 50 shows, and he tries out his new material, and all comedians do this. And he tells jokes, and some jokes no one laughs at, so he gets rid of those. But the jokes that people laugh at, he keeps. Mm-hmm. And so Hitler spoke spontaneously, and he watched the crowds. And every time the crowd went roar, he'd think, yes, one. And then the crowd would roar about something else, he'd think two. And soon everything he said made the crowd roar. And the crowd is a conscienceless mob. And so the conscienceless mob called out the devil in Hitler. Why? Well, the Germans were angry. Well, why? Well, World War I, there were brutalized men everywhere. The Versailles Treaty, the absolute collapse of the economy, their wounded pride. They had reasons to be bitter and nihilistic. And so there was a deep longing for a target, a reason, an external reason. It was the Jews, it was the gypsies, it was the people who are different. They're responsible for this. And Hitler he gave voice to that. He gave voice and emotion to that. And so maybe without Hitler, it wouldn't have happened, but maybe another populist would have come along and done something equivalent, in a slightly different direction.
Didn't Jung also make the point that it was only possible in Germany because Germany was the most evolved? I'm using the term not literally. Well, they were the furthest away from their archetypal roots, right? It was the most philosophers.
Peak of
it was the most
civilization,
conductors, right? Only at the peak of civilization can you be so far removed from the shadow that the shadow can overtake you.
Well, Jung believed that part of what drove the Nazi spirit forward was the re-sacralization of the political. So Germany had collapsed into a godless materialist atheism in some real sense, and so that brought forth a deep longing for the archetypal gods, and Hitler provided that. Orwell knew that. I mean, when Orwell started to warn about the Nazis, one of the things he warned about, he was so courageous, he said, you underestimate these people. They've harnessed these primordial forces of spectacle and blood and fire and beauty. They've rekindled the ancient gods, and Jung thought it was Odin on the warpath again in some fundamental sense. And so the reason Germany was prone to that, I suppose, is because they were the farthest along the technocratic, materialist, atheist path, and that set up this longing for a return to in some real sense, to the pagan gods.
Well, those who don't remember history are doomed to
be possessed by it again.
Right. And in some ways
Nazis,
it's like...
The Nazis knew this. It's not like they didn't play with pagan imagery constantly.
Absolutely. The iconography is very clear.
But it doesn't work if you're close to real pagan industry, if it's still interwoven in your life, if you still have... your roots go all the way down into archetypes and ritual.
Well, I suppose the Germans, in some sense, would have been most prone to the temptations of the Luciferian intellect too, because they were extremely successful in their towers of Babel.
The figure of Faust looms very large in German art and literature, obviously from Goethe onwards. But the Mephistophelian pact is just really fundamental to German culture and German consciousness.
You sell your soul to the devil, not so much for knowledge in some sense, but for power, right? And that can be technological power, but it's not knowledge. It's
all of the other things that were being promised in the late 20s and early 30s in Germany, absolutely, yeah.
But artistic power, and it was the power in the elites. It was in the arts. It was in philosophy. It was in music composition. It was in everything.
You could also see that, given that Germany, in some sense, was at the pinnacle of that civilization, the fact that they were so profoundly defeated and then humiliated was also what that produces a wounded pride and narcissism, and that's certainly part of the Luciferian spirit. So, but that idea. Look, here's a good example of that. So when police were interviewing children when they were investigating the satanic daycare accusations back in the 1980s, the children would come up with absolutely hair-raising tales of satanic ritual abuse, like young children. You think, well, where did they get that? Well, often what would happen was that a child with a mother who is a paranoid schizophrenic or bordering on it would start to get delusional about what people might have been doing to her child when she left them in the daycare. Now, she was guilty because she left them in the daycare, and now she's wondering, oh, well, I left my children with strangers. What could they be up to? And then because she was bordering on psychosis, she'd have these incredible delusional fantasies. And then, being disturbed, she'd start to bother her children. It's like, wait, does anybody do anything to you? And children partly construct the way that they react to the world by looking at whether what they say grasps the attention of adults. And so the child would be struggling to find the words that would satisfy the mother's curiosity, and struggling with that, and then they'd go to sleep at night and have a dream. And the dream would get nightmarish, and that's because the dream was trying to model what it is that the mother was calling forth out of them. And then you could run that for a couple of weeks, and the child would be telling all sorts of horrific stories. And then the police would come in, and they'd investigate in relationship to the children, and they'd get even more grotesque and catastrophic fantasies out of the kids. And then they'd think, well, the kids couldn't be inventing this, but they weren't. They were co-inventing it. And this is what happened in some sense to Hitler under the sway of the German people. It's like he had his flaws, many of them, right? Many, wounded narcissism being not paramount among them, because he was also very orderly and disgust sensitive.
Which is funny because he had separating gums. So it's like, Poor guy.
Yeah. Well, right. Well, and
Like
he
he's like, vile in certain senses, and then overcoming it and scouring
Well, he
rats
is a
and
worshiper of
homeless and Slavs
Yes,
and Jews
exactly.
with his own disdain for his, twisted psyche.
and for his own mortality. Right?
Yeah.
And he was a worshiper of the will. He was perfectly proud that he could stand like this for hours on end in the back of a car. He regarded that as a signal evidence of his discipline and conscientiousness, And so, but in any case, Hitler was willing to go exactly where the mob took him and was already motivated to go in a very dark direction. He'd been rejected, was it by the Vienna School of Art 3 times? He was a struggling street artist. He'd been brutalized by World War I. He was a decorated war hero. I think he was the only survivor of part of his platoon because a grenade blew up all of his friends when he was off doing something peripheral. And so he had a survivor's complex as well, and an idea that he had a destiny because of that. And then he was homeless, as you pointed out. And of course, the communists were threatening Germany at the time, and there were reason to be paranoid about that. And it was all set up for a perfect storm. But Hitler definitely allowed the mob to call forth the darkest fantasies possible out of the recesses of his soul.
In light of that, I'd like to read to you what Heinrich Heine, the great German poet, wrote exactly 100 years before Hitler came to power. And this is so relevant to our themes of the need for God and religion. So this is a secular Jew writing this, the great German poet Heinrich Heine. Christianity, and this is its greatest merit, has somewhat mitigated that brutal German love of war, but it could not destroy it. Should that subduing talisman, the cross, be shattered, the frenzied madness of the ancient warriors, that insane berserk rage of which Nordic bards have spoken and sung so often, will once more burst into flame. This talisman, the cross, is fragile, and the day will come when it will collapse miserably. Then a play will be performed in Germany, which will make the French Revolution look like an innocent walk in the park.
The Wartburg.
Isn't that unbelievable?
When was that written?
1834.
Wow.
The Wartburg
The prophetic voice.
is a very important building for German consciousness because it was where Luther hid away as Junker Jörg when he was obviously in danger. And it was in the Wartburg that he threw the ink pot at the devil. You can still see the bit of ink on in Luther's cell. And apparently in 1933, the Nazis tried to replace the cross, because in the Wartburg there's always a cross flying, a flag of the cross flying. And in 1933, when the Nazis took power, they replaced the cross with the swastika.
Mm-hmm. It's an anti-cross. The swastika is an anti-cross.
And the locals wouldn't have it. They had to take the swastika down, which is quite interesting in terms of this tension between the Christian inheritance, and of course this was particularly associated with Luther, and then the attempt to, as it were, repress that Christian inheritance that you found, among the Nazis, particularly Himmler. But,
Jordan, one of my favorite observations you've had is when you said, if you're scared of strong men, you should be terrified of what weak men can do. Mm-hmm. And I always think about that with Hitler, such a great example of that.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, that bitterness and that resentment, that feeling of
that, lack of positive masculinity, let's say, right, of integration.
Well, and also in some sense, also no clear pathway forward. It wasn't like it was a picnic for ex-soldiers in Germany in the 1920s. So, we always have to remember that a fair bit of his suffering in some sense was come by honestly. It was no joke to be in the trenches. It's no joke to have all your friends die. It's no joke to be homeless and rejected. And so I'm not obviously justifying any of that, because people can come out of that not being Hitler, let's say. But
the power of a resentful populism
You
is something
bet-
we
you
should
bet
keep
resentment,
a
man.
very close eye on.
yeah, that's for sure. In every way. Yeah. Resentment. I never saw anything among my clinical clients that was more destructive than resentment. And that's the spirit of Cain, right? That not only am I resentful, but it's justifiable. I can shake my fist at God and I have the right on my side. You know, it's really, really not good. Maybe it's worse than pride. And they're intertangled,
The only thing that competes
right?
with it is betrayal.
Yeah. You can't appeal to betrayal the way you can appeal to resentment.
Right.
You can suffer from betrayal, but you can appeal to resentment. So,
Resentment justifies anything.
yes. Yeah, and that's also the underground motivation for resentment. Like if you're possessed by the desire for power, you can certainly capitalize on your resentment. So,
Dennis, can I ask very quickly, you just started this fascinating phase of our discussion by talking about the way in which you think the Torah endorses some kind of notion of collective guilt.
In the way that,
Yeah.
that Jordan was talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
So I just think there are two kinds. There's one that's sort of, collective guilt in the present. But the debate that's really haunting the political landscape at the moment is the kind of,
right.
whether there's a kind of diachronic,
that has an answer.
historical collective guilt.
God bless you. That is a great distinction, and the Torah has an antidote. There is a law in the Torah. Law. It's a commandment from God himself. You may not hate the Egyptians.
okay. Right.
So that ends that whole issue. Egypt is no longer guilty. Whites are no longer guilty, if that's what you had in mind.
And that's symbolized in ceremonially with the drops of wine.
Right. Did I mention that on it?
Yeah.
I didn't?
No,
okay,
it's
so
worth
very
mentioning
quickly, at the Passover Seder, and as I noted, it's universal. It was not at all specific to my family or community. When the 10 plagues are listed at the Passover Seder, the Jew puts the pinky into the cup of wine. We drink 4 cups of wine. Those who can handle it, I can't. And you remove some wine with each plague as your way of saying, I'm not going to increase but decrease my happiness over their suffering.
So there's no Schadenfreude there.
Right. The tradition is better than me. If I did 10 plagues over Germany, I'm not sure I would dip my finger in. When I read about the bombings of Germany, I'm very torn.
If you don't have sympathy for that, it's very difficult to understand it. Meaning, one of the things I tried to do when I was reading about the Nazi atrocities is I tried to imagine myself as an Auschwitz guard who enjoyed it. And that takes sympathy. It's a very dangerous thing to do, and no one wants to do that, because when people read about the Holocaust, they want to think, well, they'd be a victim or they'd be a hero, a redeeming hero. It's like statistically, well, maybe you'd be a victim, but the probability you'd be a redeeming hero in the face of the Hitlerian nightmares.
minimal.
I think it's
minimal.
the only inoculation that one would have to not do that, to say, I'd be the one who'd get out of line and stand with the Jews and be executed, is if you know that you, in all likelihood, would not be that person.
Right.
Then you have a chance.
That's
I
right.
wrote a screenplay. I was adapted a wonderful book called Black Flags. It won the Pulitzer by Joby Warwick. It's spectacular. It's about Zarqawi. And Zarqawi was, in many regards, incredibly flawed, horrifying, monstrous genius, right? He revolutionized terrorism, basically. He had a big plan to drop a chemical bomb on Amen, and the Mubarak got ahead of it, and so he figured he could kidnap one American tourist and saw his head off, right, Nick Berg. And in doing so, he made sure it was recorded in a particular way that broadband was just becoming accessible in the U.S., and he made sure it was exactly released in a format that it could go the most widely to the U.S. to have the biggest impact, and it's the lowest resources. He personalized terror. And one of my theses when I was writing about him was that, he's like Steve Jobs, right? Steve Jobs looked at a phone long enough until it was no longer a phone. He was transformative. There's something that was godlike in his ability to figure out exactly the most excruciating forms of terrorism. He was so bad that Bin Laden apologized for him. And every 2 weeks, because when you're writing a character, you have to inhabit them. The goal is to pull on their mask and see the world through their eye holes. And every 2 weeks, I would watch again, when I was writing this, the beheading. And it was horrifying. I mean, it's like that full body sweat, like and it's horrifying. And the sound of it. But it was like, I'm not going to lose myself in moral relativism, right? But I'm writing from him. I have to write from his position of where he came from and how he was radicalized and what about him was brilliant, right? And what campaign and what his grievances were. But I kept mooring myself in that. You go back and watch that again, and it's like, it's inconceivable almost to witness once, let alone. But I think that's part of what you're saying about trying to find...
Well, I think it's also part of that motif of taking the world's sins upon yourself. It's like, well, people did this, and you're a person. And you think, well, no, I couldn't. It's like, don't be so sure about that. And then maybe there's something even worse, which is, if you're so sure you couldn't do it, you might be so sure you couldn't do it in precise proportion to the degree that you would be vulnerable to do it if the situation was right.
Like Germany in the 1930s, so evolved, right?
Right, exactly.
So wondrously evolved. It's the last place something like that could happen. It's like, nope, it's the only place that's going to happen.
Well, that's what they always asked. How could the country that produced Beethoven, Goethe, and Schiller produce Auschwitz? I resonate to the question, and I don't resonate to the question, because I would say of the 10 saddest revelations of my life, and this was one of the first, because I'm crazy about classical music. It's deeply important to my life. And I had to make peace with the fact that you could love Mozart and build Auschwitz. It hurt me terribly.
Well,
I really thought it makes you better to love Bach.
Yeah, well, that's the whole realm of the human experience, though, isn't it? That spans the entire range. And, you know, part of that Christian idea that the Savior of the world takes the sins upon himself, that really means to encompass that entire span and then to try to reconcile it. And the span stretches, what does Jung say? A tree that wants to reach up into heaven has to grow its roots all the way into hell. And I think that's really true, because how can you defeat the devil without understanding him? And if the devil's in your heart, then you have to understand that in your heart.
It's your only inoculation.
It's your only inoculation. You mean to see yourself going there and then decide not to, or see how you could go there.
Also to engage with it in a way that doesn't make it wholly alien to you.
Right.
The inoculation is to try to engage with it in some manner. And so in the process of the writing this is very intimate when I'm writing something, I'm in it 24/7. And so if I'm writing this story, the inoculation, it's like going in and trying to understand it.
Well, your books have got better and better, and I would say more and more successful as your villains have got more and more human. Not that they're not better villains in the moral sense. They're worse and worse.
Right.
But they're also more and more understandable and human. And that makes them much more terrifying, strangely enough.
I think I had to grow up enough to realize that antagonists and protagonists are much more compelling than villains and heroes. Because I started...
Sorry, just about your reflection about Mozart and Goethe, for that matter. And by the way, Goethe was an anti-nationalist. I mean, Goethe was at a time where German nationalism was very important. He was very hostile to the idea, and I think one has to remember the extent of German resentment going through the centuries, and this was partly to do with the Holy Roman Empire and what they call the Kleinstaatlerei, the very divided nature of the German regions, and for that reason their sense of vulnerability. And you had that sense that at the Reformation Germany had been divided. Then you have Germany at the mercy of very powerful neighboring nation, particularly France. So the humiliation by France under Louis XIV. Then Napoleon. Many of those who died in Napoleon's Russian campaign were Germans. The Bavarians in particular, but large numbers. So the Germans had this long-standing feeling that they were weak, that they were humiliated. So the First World War comes on the back of this long centuries sense of being humiliated, abused, and a deep sense of resentment. The idea that French is the cultured language, that French, I mean, the German aristocracy, they would speak French to each other, you know. French was, of course, the language of the courts. Frederick the Great's castle was called Sans Souci. He thought German, the greatest, the king of Prussia, thought German was a pretty nasty language, really. So I think your point about resentment in the soul as being this deeply poisonous and transformative power is very significant in this.
The story of Cain is so unbelievably powerful because...
So it's not just how does this amazingly sophisticated, scientifically brilliant, poetic, the Land der Dichter und Denker, the land of poets and thinkers, how did it suddenly become so satanic? It's also a long history of resentment and feeling of being humiliated, and we need to take our place.
Well, resentment resentment's a real rough one too, because it's really easy to confuse with the desire for justice, right? And there is a desire for justice and a need for it, but resentment perverts the sense of justice. It perverts it to your own ends because it perverts justice to the designs of revenge, essentially. And that revenge can become, really, it becomes cosmic. I mean, I've read a lot about the thinking and writing of serial killers and people who shot up high schools and that kind of thing. And what you see is that the deeper the crime, the more cosmic the resentment. And it's really the case. It gets to the point where the only language you can use to describe the motivation is satanic. And often the perpetrators themselves use that language, right?
Well, think how impersonal your anger has to be, how cosmic it has to be to slaughter a school full of people who you hardly know. Stephen, I feel like, has been our Jiminy Cricket of conscience, pointing out the choice, the constant choice, and with the Pharaoh and the strengthening. And one of the other things I'm thinking about so much is we're regarding this text, which is, no matter, it's a holy text, right? No matter whether that's a capital H or a lowercase h, depending on how people go to it. And one of the ways to engage with any text of meaning, we were talking yesterday about Rogerian listening, right? Where you engage at the nervous system. And part of it is when we're reading this, part of what we're doing is practicing the question, I think, Dennis, that you're raising, because we all also have to be the Pharaoh in some regards if you're going to engage with a text, right? One of the jobs of writing or carving, right, or creating any kind of art is, like, I think about Caravaggio all the time, where some minor player in the background is fully three-dimensionalized. We're not just meant to be the role of Moses when we're reading this. We're meant to also embrace and engage and see the Pharaoh in ourselves. And that's something, like, you keep bringing that back to the personal and psychological also. And I think that's that notion of the inoculating factor is, why are we spending so much time with somebody who's so stubborn that he keeps hardening his heart and people are dying and all this happens? It's like, that's us also, right? And just like and
it's also the thing in us that keeps us from claiming the freedom that allows us to serve God properly. So he's really the antithetical enemy. And you can say, well, what the biblical corpus does in large part is walk you through all the domains of mankind. It's right. Here's the whole panoply of the possible human experience.
Embody them all. Listen to them, attend to them.
Like they're you.
As Rogers did. Soften yourself to the vulnerability of encountering all them.
Well, it also lets the text speak to you. You know, I think part of the reason that the first biblical series I did was serious was because I approached the text as if it might have something to teach me. That was the a priori presumption, right? Which is what you have to do if you read a text that's written by great thinkers, too. It's like, well, Nietzsche's a good example. It's like, well, that was Nietzsche, you know? You might give some credence to the notion that there's something in there to learn. And maybe you don't take all of it. You can take, the right spoils from the Egyptians in the service of the right thing. And maybe you leave some of what's there behind. But that in the Passion story, which what it's doing in part is it's taking you through all of that all at once, right? Because you're you're Pilate who says what is truth, and you're the tyrannical Roman, and you're the mob that calls for the death of the innocent.
And you're washing your hands.
You bet, you bet. And you have to be, as well as being the suffering person who's taking all of this on. And all of that has to be equally real. And maybe then you decide which of those characters you'd rather be aligned with, And
well, the practice of this right now, part of what, like you were talking about, Dennis, earlier, that everything's a miracle. The birth of an ant is a miracle. Like us being here having this discussion. We're increasingly in a culture where our engagement with things is so bifurcated. We're not allowed to even engage with there's no conceivable notion to engage with the full perspective of the other side. And there's 100 ways that define that beyond just the obviously red and blue. And it's like we keep, and so much of what
if you demonize the other, you don't have to embody it.
That's right.
That's convenient.
You dehumanize. It's not a part of you. Mm-hmm. And so much of what the study of text is, what the study of story is that form of an inoculation for your own individuation. That's what we're doing here.
That's right. Well, that's what should happen in the humanities education, is that, no, you have to embody all these characters.
Right.
So, well, gentlemen, that seems like a meet place to stop, I would say. We've run out our 2 hours, and we got through a lot of material, and I was wondering at the beginning of this, well, we'll probably just zip through the plagues because there's this repetition, and it turns out, well, just as you'd expect, that if you pay enough attention to the text, there's nothing to run through quickly. All right, so thank you everyone for who's watching and listening, and thank you once again to the Daily Wire crew for setting this up, and to all of you for taking the time and effort necessary in this really miraculous occurrence, I would say, and I really do view it that way. It's unbelievably unlikely that we've been able to assemble ourselves like this, and to be able to talk like this, and to be able to bring this to the attention of many, many people. And it's very appropriate not to underestimate the likelihood of something like that occurring, and being appreciative of it, as I think we all are in a very deep sense, and also to the people the technical people and everyone whose faith in this unlikely venture has made it possible.
And is not the gratitude a part of the genuinely religious mind, in the way that resentment is a part of...
It's the opposite of... Gratitude is the opposite of resentment. Yeah, it's why you want to practice it as a virtue. It's like, what do I have to be grateful for? Look at my suffering. It's like, well, it's incumbent upon you to discover that which you should be grateful for. Yeah, it's especially if you're suffering, especially if you're suffering. We really learned that with Michaela, is to try to find, it's like in all that pain, to try to find what you can hold on to that's real in the midst of that. And that's an orientation towards gratitude.
You move towards where you put your attention. I mean, that's exactly what we're
right
discussing.
Gratitude is also maybe a note to end on, because I think this is Douglas's last session with us this time around.
Yes. I do believe that we're going to rekindle this. This is August right now, or end of July. And I do believe we plan to rekindle this in January, because we won't get through the whole book. And yes, it's been absolutely wonderful having you here, and a real privilege to have you come here. And it's also been, for all of you who are listening, it's been ridiculously fun. We've been jet skiing around on the ocean in Miami. And so when we're not studying the book of Exodus and eating steaks and drinking bourbon, not me, even though I'd like to. Anyways, Douglas, thank you very much for coming. And it's been great to have you here, and look forward to having you here again for sure. So.
All the Egyptian gods have been vanquished, and now the firstborn, that's an encapsulation of the tradition of Egypt, is being killed, right, while the Israelites are being spared. So it's the ultimate decimation of the tradition of the Egyptians.
And so it's like right in the text, a few verses from each other, you see the people have compassion for the Israelites, and then it says, no, but their children are going to die too. So that's why I feel like there is a sense in which we're meant to have compassion, even for the Egyptians in the narrative.
Much of this calls for the radical acceptance of that. You certainly see that in Christianity with the idea of the sacrifice of the Lamb of God, but obviously that idea stems from this idea and this practice.